so I was introduced, but there's two of us. Well, you've got a 2-for-1 here. It's what I believe in, getting efficiencies. And my colleague here is Des, who happened to be, when I was in Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service, happened to be my first boss. So I came out of training school, knew nothing, learnt a lot. Okay, and now I've got Des involved in this business with me, hopefully to do the same sort of thing, to help me progress and help the business progress. So
I'm going to cover a couple of aspects to start off with the presentation from two facets really. My experience in the Fire and Rescue Service. I served in the Fire and Rescue Service for 36 years in Royal Berkshire, in Wiltshire and in Cornwall. Finished off in Cornwall. Ironically, my first week in Cornwall when I arrived there was 2 years after the Penhallow fire, and it was just at the time where they were starting off with the coroner's inquest into that tragic fire, the worst hotel fire in England in 40 years actually. Why do I bring that up? That will come apparent as we go further into the presentation. The other aspect I'm going to use a couple of anecdotes from is my experience of fitting sprinklers in my own home. So first of all, why is there resistance to sprinklers? Initially, the cost. In Cornwall, I invited Anne Jones. Anne Jones will be familiar with many of you, did some fantastic work in Wales and really drove that very dynamic situation, and she changed the legislation with a lot of support from North Wales, with Chris Innes, the Deputy Chief at the time. Really good stuff. Anne came down to Cornwall, we did a couple of big seminars, we engaged with developers and really pushed it forward. Despite the initial surprise from developers about how cost effective, how cheap they were to fit in comparison with a whole build, they often found reasons not to fit them. I really thought I'd cracked it at one stage when a very large developer, not confined to the southwest, broader UK, actually came up with an idea and said it wasn't the panacea, but I thought, well, if this moves things on, it'll be great. And he said, well, at first fix, what we can do is put all the pipework in, all the carcassing in, and then if the residents want the sprinklers, when they move in, when they choose their homes, we can then fit the heads afterwards. Not the panacea, but it was a way forward. Unfortunately, despite many follow-up calls by my fire safety officers and what have you, unfortunately, it didn't get off the ground. So with one or two exceptions in Cornwall, I'm afraid over the 6 years I was there, we didn't get particularly far. The last 3 years of my time I've spent as the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor for the Welsh Government. So again, I know a fair bit about how that legislation has been implemented in Wales. Image and aesthetics as well is also an issue, and I think, well, I know Bob will cover that in more detail. Really, when it comes to the aesthetics, I really think there's very little excuse for that in new builds, but I have seen, as probably all of you, some retrofits that haven't been particularly sympathetic to their surroundings. But I've also seen some retrofits that have been mind-blowing, really good. Cost to install sprinklers also. Another anecdote I'll bring up is the issue about when I fitted sprinklers in my own home, was the building control officer who came along and engaged with me was really excited because he said, well, somebody's fitting residential sprinklers. First time in 24 years as a building control officer he'd seen somebody fit residential sprinklers. So that proves how little we've moved on, doesn't it, really? There's someone there at the sharp end, seen very little of it. He did, as part of his thesis back in the mid-90s for his degree, he did a piece of work, he did a survey, and he asked a survey of 200 people as to, given a certain cost, I think it was about £900 to £1,000, would they rather have sprinklers fitted in their home or carpets? 82% said carpets. I have to say, if he then revisited that now, I'm sad to say, I think he would probably get a broad or same response. Bob.
Okay, so costs. We'll move on to aesthetics and how things can change and why we're here. Well, Lumi-Plugin was a spin-off and become a separate company from my original company, which is a fire risk assessment company, and it actually does what Stuart asked for earlier on. It actually takes the fire risk assessment and turns it into a live, living, breathing risk management document. That's not a document, it's an online system that taps the building manager on the shoulder and tells him or her when things are needed to be done. We built up a pretty good reputation. And by the time the coroner's court happened to come along for John, the guy that's on the right-hand side here, John contacted us and asked our advice of what questions he should ask from the evidence. He didn't understand, he had no fire background, no training in fire safety, but he wanted to know why his mum and his brother had died and perished in a fire that was completely unnecessary. They died in the Penhallow fire, which we all understand and believe was a preventable tragedy. It was a fantastic building overlooking the harbour, and it wasn't a star rated or regularly inspected hotel. It didn't need to be. The owners that owned that hotel owned others, and a transport company which used to bus the pensioners in from one to the other, and so they really went under the radar. As a result of the fire, which this just shows you how quickly the fire can take place, the building was lost and so were 3 lives. Aesthetics. Aesthetics are another reason why people sometimes object to it. And you can, as Des pointed out, you can see why sometimes it doesn't need to look like this, but sometimes people do cheap and cheerful, or that'll do. In my belief, that'll do, won't do. What I've developed is a new way of looking at things, and we've got some samples out there in the foyer if you want to come afterwards and find out about a bit more. But effectively, instead of a 2-for-1, you end up with a 3-for-1. Okay, so you end up with an LED, double LED light, a 3-hour emergency battery pack plugs into it, and in the centre of it is a concealed sprinkler head. So there's no reasons now to say aesthetically I don't like the glass bulbs poking out, I don't like this or that. It's hidden, and in the site that it has been installed in, you don't even know that they're there. This is an example of where it has been installed. So just try to get the pointer. Oh, there we go. So this one here in the stairwell, that's the sprinkler and that's the smoke detector. In that kitchen, there's also a heat detector and there's a sprinkler, but you won't be able to tell where it is because the lights are on. And that's the whole idea. It becomes streamlined and you lose that aesthetic argument. This is actually a make-believe picture, a little bit like the bridge earlier on. But this is a typical reception area of a hotel. And then in that area there is smoke detection, sprinklers, lights, emergency lights, and sounders. If you adopt that same principle, you end up losing all that clutter on the ceiling, and it looks much, much better. So we're kind of getting rid of the aesthetics concerns. This is the more difficult one. We all know about him. He's the main culprit. Des reckons that's him about 10 years ago, but I'm not so sure. Okay, so you all know the action shot. He jumps through the doorway in his wife beater, putting out his 9mm pistol, and from 20 feet away he shoots out a little tiny glass bulb that then floods the whole building when the sprinklers go off. Hopefully you all know that sprinklers don't operate that way. But the vast majority of people, when they come to say, do you want sprinklers or do you want carpets, one of the things that are on the back of their minds is, but if the sprinkler goes off, my whole house floods, because of this kind of understanding or lack of.
I would certainly also raise another issue, because I actually think it's worse than that. The number of people that have been inside my house during the build process and afterwards not only thought that the sprinklers all went off, but I was amazed by the number of people that didn't fundamentally understand the difference between a sprinkler and a smoke detector. And I'm talking about some people that are very close to the building industry, had no idea what the difference was. That is very worrying.
I've kind of covered that one with that one there. Okay, so from a personal plea, as